Welcome to Storytime, where shadows come alive, and every tale leads you deeper into the unknown. Gather round if you dare, for tonight we open the book to your nightmares. Shadows in the Mirror. Megan had always hated the old mirror in her grandmother's attic. Its antique frame was carved with grotesque faces, each twisted into expressions of horror and agony. Yet it held a certain allure. For years it had sat there draped in a dusty, moth-eaten cloth, casting an ominous presence throughout the room. One rainy evening, after a frustrating day at work, Megan found herself standing before the mirror, its blackened glass barely reflecting her tired face. She had come up to the attic to look for old family photo albums, but the mirror had drawn her in. Before she could stop herself, she pulled the cloth away, revealing its full, dark surface. As she gazed into the mirror, the room behind her seemed to dim, leaving only her reflection and a growing sense of dread. She blinked and felt a chill run down her spine. Something was different. The reflection was not quite right. The attic behind her in the mirror was shrouded in shadow, darker and deeper than it should be. Her reflection's eyes seemed to flicker, a hint of movement that didn't match her own. Megan shook her head and turned away, but a slight movement caught her eye. She turned back, heart pounding. In the depths of the mirror, a shadow shifted, breaking away from the darkness. It wasn't her reflection moving. It was something behind her. Something not in the room. Fear tightened her chest as the shadow began to take form. It stretched, elongating into a tall, thin figure with eyes as black as the mirror's surface. It stood just behind her reflection, watching her with an unnatural stillness. Megan glanced over her shoulder. The room was empty, but in the mirror, the figure remained, leaning closer to her reflection, its mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. "No," she whispered, stepping back. But the shadow reached out, a long, twisted hand emerging from the mirror's surface. Megan stumbled, crashing into an old chair. The attic around her seemed to grow darker, colder. The shadow figure pressed its hand against the inside of the glass as if testing the boundary between their worlds. Megan wanted to run, to flee the attic, and never look back. But she was frozen, eyes locked onto the mirror. The shadow began to push, the glass rippling like water under its touch. Slowly, its hand breached the surface, fingers long and skeletal reaching toward Megan. "No," she screamed, finally finding her voice. She grabbed the cloth and threw it over the mirror. For a moment, silence filled the attic. She held her breath, heart pounding against her ribs. Then she heard it, a faint, dragging sound like nails scratching on glass. She backed away, her eyes locked on the covered mirror. The cloth began to twitch, small movements at first, then a sharp, violent tug from within. Shadows danced beneath the fabric, shifting and swirling as if battling to break free. Megan stumbled back down the attic stairs, slamming the door behind her. She ran to her room, bolting the door shut. But even there, in the darkness of her bedroom, she could feel it. Something watching her. She glanced at her vanity, where a small hand mirror lay innocently on the tabletop. Its surface was dark, almost too dark, as if a shadow had settled within it. She approached cautiously, picking up the mirror with trembling hands. Her reflection stared back, wide-eyed and pale. But then, there it was, the shadow, standing just behind her in the reflection, grinning. The lights in her room flickered and went out. In the darkness, Megan felt cold fingers graze the back of her neck. She screamed, dropping the mirror, and as it shattered on the floor, she heard a whisper, cold and hissing, "I am here." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. She glanced around, eyes wide, but nothing moved. The lights flickered back on, casting a dull, warm glow. Broken glass littered the floor, and her reflection, now fragmented, stared back in 100 different pieces. But in each shard, behind her fractured image, the shadow loomed, smiling. From that day on, Megan could never look into a mirror without seeing them. The shadows. They followed her, taunting her from every reflective surface. And no matter how many mirrors she shattered, they always returned, lurking just behind her, waiting for the day they could pull her into the darkness forever.